The American middle class is the most important component of all that makes up this republic, this democracy. From 1945 until 1975, the American middle class was ascendant, growing more wealthy, numerous, influential in our society. For 3 decades, it flourished, and for the last 4 decades, it has faltered and diminished. It is time to examine what made the middle class powerful, brought it about, and how we might revisit these conditions, in order to reverse this process, in order to defend and ensure our republic. After World War II, the nation was in debt. 120% of GDP, gross domestic product. The debt was cut in half in 10 years, just 10 years, using an average inflation rate of 4.2%. No debt payments were ever made, ever. Inflation was the tool that was consciously used as the only means of attacking the national debt. America enjoyed 3 decades of 4% gross domestic product growth. 4% GDP growth. The highest tax bracket averaged 81%. These are averages basically from the end of the war until 75. These are approximations, but they're correct. So basically you have an inflation rate of 4%, you have GDP growth of about 4% average, and you have the highest tax bracket being taxed at 81% on average over the 3 decades. This was, in essence, the components that made these the best of times possible. Now, historically, the only way that economic inequality worldwide, in any place, anywhere over time, has ever been fixed is by either two things: a great war or plagues. World War II was the reset button on the entire world economic order. In the United States, the secret components of this gumbo was this unique mix of GDP growth, moderately high inflation, and tax policy that sets the economic tenor for the successful, booming 3 decades. America produced 50% of the world's manufactured goods. 1 in 3 jobs was basically a union job in manufacturing. And the people who ran capitalism, our corporate elites and our political elites, they were on their best behavior during the Cold War because the whole world is watching, and it's, in essence, it's not just a military contest or an economic contest. This is a contest, it's like a beauty contest before the whole world between communism and capitalism. The space race was nothing less than an extension of that, fighting without fighting. So capitalism was on its best behavior with the whole world watching. Hence civil rights in 1964. The World War II generation had had a unique experience: the Great Depression, the Great War. They were imbued with an optimism, kind of a can-do spirit of the age that characterized these 3 decades. These guys had gone out there at the age of basically like 19, 21, and they had defeated the most fearsome war machine that had ever stalked the earth. The Nazi war machine killed 27 million Russians. And because we had wise leadership, political and military, the United States suffered basically 400,000 combat military deaths. So, nevertheless, this represented like nearly one in every 6 soldiers or airmen, perhaps less. These men were shoulder to shoulder with each other at this young age, young adulthood, boys really. And between the terror of combat was the long periods of boredom, and they shared each other's hopes and dreams and memories of home and what they would do after they got home. And of course, many of these young men did not ever come home. And the ones that did remembered not only their own dreams, but the unfulfilled dreams of those who would remain forever young, that they'd spent those long hours with. And so they were imbued with having destroyed the Nazi war machine and Japanese militarism, imbued not with just a can-do spirit, but a sense of the courage to go for their dreams. Because so many people that they had known, so many men, young men, that they had known, would never have that chance. And they had somehow survived. So what did they have to lose? If they had a dream, what possible excuse could they possibly have for not actually going for it? So this was part of the can-do spirit of the age, was the courage to actually gamble on your dreams. America was the greatest nation on earth because of victory, competency, and freedom. American exceptionalism was not an abstraction. It was a state of mind. It was an unstated truth in every mind, a shared ethos. We could accomplish anything, whether going to the moon, destroying an evil empire. After all, we had destroyed evil empires before. People in these 3 decades generally had an intense work ethic, having been raised by people who grew up on farms or ranches if they hadn't actually had that experience themselves. They developed and were taught an intense work ethic, and they felt shame in accepting charity. There was no such thing as debt, personal debt, and credit cards to speak of. The ethic was one of delayed gratification, avoiding personal debt, and accepting personal responsibility. There was no welfare state outside of Social Security. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. The primary driving force of this optimism was based on an economic reality that had never existed before in the history of the world. The middle class in America was king because wealth and income were more evenly distributed, not perfectly equitable, yet it was better than it had ever been in any society anywhere over such a large population. Was the optimism of the age a result of these economic conditions? And perhaps in the age we find ourselves today, the age of pessimism and cynicism, is this ethos similarly rooted in our economic conditions? The creation of the American middle class was perhaps the largest and widest distribution of wealth and income at the middle 40%, and the highest general standard of living among masses the world had ever seen. It was all made possible by a perfect storm of increased productivity through mechanization, the age of machines, universal, compulsory, free education, and union wages from collective bargaining, and of course the reset button on the world economic order that was World War II. Remember, it's either a plague or a war that resets the economic order, the distribution of wealth. Even as late as 1910, in America and Europe, the distribution of wealth was more like that of centuries past. People living in 1900 economically had more in common with people living in 1600 than they did just a few decades later with people living in the 1950s and the 1960s. All the great fortunes had been destroyed by war and later high taxes. Factory jobs during and after the war kept increasing the pay scale at the bottom, while the National Labor Board froze pay at the top. The meritocracy redistributed money to a whole new group of human beings that formed the new top 10%, the reset button. An average tax rate of 81% at the top over 30 years kept too much wealth from pooling unproductively at the top. 3 decades of 4% GDP growth. This growth is probably a kind of a Goldilocks number of not too hot, not too cold. Inflation of 4.5% reduced the national debt and forced capital to go out and earn its keep, or risk being chewed up by inflation while sitting unproductively in a bank account or some other similar unproductive pursuit. However, by the 1980s and 90s, GDP growth dropped to 3%, and the top tax rates fell as well, allowing the top 10% to begin to retain significantly more wealth relative to the bottom 90%. From 2000 on, growth fell again below 2%. And by 2015, the top 10% in America were in the exact same position they had occupied in 1910. The world had come full circle. And economists were now issuing dire warnings that growth rates would never again reach above 2%. Now, what we have is we've seen a cycle of the creation of this vast middle class and then the slow destruction of the same. What does this portend? To my mind, in all likelihood, without a middle class, democracy will be a fading former shadow of itself, as kind of a South American style authoritarian capitalism like that of our adversaries. I mean, it'll be perpetuated by violence because a system of fundamental unfairness can only be perpetuated by violence. Eventually, the dispossessed, lower 90%, will essentially probably emulate the Venezuelan experience of socialism. The political class will see its opening and they will offer the vast pool of poor people access to the state treasury, unlimited access, just like the South American model. Venezuela is a nation that sits on 300 billion barrels of oil worth $18 trillion. But after 20 years of socialism, Venezuelan citizens are fleeing Venezuela by the millions. 500,000 Venezuelans have fled directly next door to Colombia, and probably as many others have fled to other nearby locations. The Venezuelan people are starving. The currency is virtually worthless paper. It has collapsed. The future of a failed United States will emulate the South American model and may vacillate between authoritarianism and socialism and back again, much like the Venezuelan experience. Either outcome, on the left or on the right, is an extreme hardship for the majority of citizens. Why do empires fall? We are the new Rome. We have enforced the peace of the world, an American peace. 70 years of peace and prosperity, by and large, for the most part, without a great war, without wholesale destruction of civilization as we know it. This is not the norm. This is far and away the exception of human history. And yet empires do fail, and they do fall. Why? Empires fail because rent-seeking behavior by the elites. Rent-seeking behavior means basically they jealously guard their ability to print money, in effect. They pass along their inherited fortunes, the elite, wealthy. They pass along their political power while exempting themselves from taxes. Their wealth buys political power, which makes even more wealth, which in turn buys even more political power. It is a feedback loop. The concentration of wealth and power has a crowding out effect on the economic life of the vast number of people who eventually lose the incentive to struggle for slim rewards, rewards that grow lesser over time. And these people who are paying the taxes, who are making up the vast majority of the working people in the society, they lose the incentive to struggle and work hard, and they lose what little they have. Farmers of ancient Rome were taxed so heavily that farming was no longer profitable. The Roman bureaucracy had mushroomed out of control, the government, and the Roman army was much larger than it had ever been before. And this was all being paid for by taxes on farming, which is never hugely profitable, even in the best of times. The farmers of ancient Rome were taxed so heavily that farming was no longer profitable, so they moved into the cities and left the land fallow. The empire is hollowed out from within. It is waiting for some external force to come along and push over the rotten walls. It appears to be an external cause of collapse, but really, it is the failure of the elites. Empires fall because of rent-seeking behavior by the elites. Are we about to follow the Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire? How can we avoid this fate? Where are the wise men who can lead us out of this maze? Our country is more divided than at any time since the Civil War. This generation knows their lives will not be as good as that of their parents. Our enemies see us as a fading power that can be undermined and defeated. Our political system has deteriorated into legalized bribery. All our troubles can be traced back to the want of an open and honest process. Our politics has created a fatal weakness, a toxic factionalism, a deadly tribalism, and a self-defeating pessimism threaten to destroy not just the Republic, but Western civilization itself. The 28th Amendment makes the taxpayer, the one who funds political campaigns, cuts out the middleman, and gives back power to the people. Politicians do not support the interests of the voters. Politicians defend the interests of their contributors, the peoples who supply the money. The 28th Amendment makes the taxpayer the one who supplies the money. From this crucial reform flows 100 others. America has always been able to self-examine, self-criticize, change, adapt, overcome. Victory is a two-thirds majority vote in the House and the Senate, then ratification by three-fourths of the state legislatures. When the 28th Amendment is law of the land, then the kingdom will come alive again. A new era will begin. The best years of our lives lie before us if we seize this possible future, this destiny of ours. Change the political system for the better, forever chiseled in the granite of the Constitution of the United States.